Okay, first we're going to begin with the overall anatomy of the female reproductive system, identify some parts, and then we'll go into more detail on these structures. First of all, ovaries. We have two ovaries, one on either side. They're connected by a tiny ligament to the back wall. We call it the ovarian ligament. They lie adjacent to the opening to the oviduct. Now, the oviduct is also known as the fallopian tube or uterine tube. The uterine tubes lead into the uterus right here. So this entire structure is uterus, the thick wall there. And it extends down into the vagina. And this is what we call the cervix. This area right through here, it means neck right there, but it extends down into the vagina a little bit right there. The cervix of the uterus. So this is vaginal wall over here. Let's go ahead and label some of these things now. I've added a few labels to our drawing. We've already identified the ovary, and we know that it's attached to the back wall by the base of the uterus, by the ovarian ligament. The oviduct, remember it's also called uterine tube or fallopian tube, has an opening that allows egg cells which leave the ovary. The ovary expels the egg cell just to the outside, and that has to get swept up into that tube. And so there's a hole there that allows that egg cell to move up into that oviduct there. The opening to that is called the ostium. Surrounding the ostium are these finger-like projections I have labeled over here as fimbria. Fimbria. So those are those finger-like projections surrounding the ostium of the oviduct. The oviduct is divided into segments. You can give it different names. First of all, the infundibulum is a funnel-shaped opening around the ostium, the infundibular portion of the oviduct. Then there's a rather more open section in the upper part of the oviduct here called the ampulla that runs through here. Then it narrows just before entering into the uterus. That narrowed portion is the isthmus of the oviduct. And then as the oviduct travels through the uterine wall right here, we call that simply the uterine portion. Of the oviduct, the uterine portion of the oviduct. So those are the four parts of the oviduct, or segments: infundibulum, ampulla, then the isthmus, and then the uterine portion of the oviduct. Fimbria are the finger-like projections. Ostium is the name given to the opening into that space there. Now let's identify parts of the uterus itself. First of all, this upper portion across here, let's do this in a different color now. Across here, right there, that's the fundus. Fundus. Fundus is just a dome-shaped structure. It's kind of a generic term, so that's the fundic portion of the uterus. We already identified this part down here as the cervix, which simply means the neck, where it narrows down here, and the remainder in between here is referred to as the body of the uterus. So we have the fundic region at the top, then the body, the main portion, and then the cervix, this narrowed portion down below. The wall of the uterus has three primary layers. I've tried to indicate with a couple of different colors here. The most internal layer is the endometrium. Indicated in pink, and then a thick layer of smooth muscle in the wall, a very heavy smooth muscle layer out here called a myometrium. And then I hardly have any of the room to write it in here, but right on the very outside is a very, very thin layer. It's just a black line on here called the perimetrium. Perimetrium. We'll talk more about the endometrium later when we talk about the female reproductive cycle. We'll talk more detail about that. Also in the uterus, below the main body chamber space, right up, cavity right up in there, we have in the cervix an upper narrowing and a lower narrowing. They call this the internal os, simple spelling there. And this second narrowing right here is the external os. So those are the portions of the uterus. From this portion at the top, then the body is the main central region. Cervix is the narrowed neck. There are two narrowings, an upper narrowing and a lower narrowing, called internal up here, os, and then external os down below. 3 layers to the uterus: endometrium, myometrium, and perimetrium. The myometrium makes up the main thickness of the wall of the uterus. That cervix extends down into the vagina. This is the vagina here. The next thing we're going to do is look at a detail of the ovary, talk about ovarian structure. Okay, now looking at the ovary, the detail in the ovary structure. The outer covering of the ovary is a continuation of the mesothelial lining of your abdominal cavity that comes out and then goes around it. Generally, we refer to that kind of covering as a visceral peritoneum. That portion of the visceral peritoneum on the outside of the ovary is referred to as germinal epithelium. And in this case, it's simple cuboidal. Instead of the simple squamous epithelium you'd find on most visceral peritoneal coverings in the abdominal cavity. So simple cuboidal epithelium around the outside is commonly referred to as germinal epithelium. Germinal referring to germination, the beginning. It was apparently at one time thought that the egg cells originated from that epithelium on the outside, but they do not. So anyway, we have that outer covering. Underneath of that, we have a dense connective tissue. It can be pretty thin, actually. It's not a very thick layer. And like in some other locations we've seen in the body, it's called a tunica albuginea. That just means a white covering. It's that dense connective tissue has a white coloration to it. So that's the name given to that. Inside of the tunica albuginea, you find a thick zone around here where you find the ovarian follicles developing, and that region is referred to as the cortex. So this region right here is cortex. And as in other organs where you have an outer zone called the cortex, you have a middle zone in here that's called the medulla. So you have a cortex and a medulla. The medulla is made primarily of loose connective tissues, indicated by the light green color here, and there are a number of blood vessels in there as well. So that's the primary material of the medulla. Your ovarian follicles are not here in the medulla of the ovary. They are to the outside, around the margins. I've begun to draw in some dots here representing the primordial follicles, the early follicles of the ovary, and they would originally in the early ovary before puberty be peppered with hundreds and hundreds, even thousands of those follicles around the outer portion of the ovary here. Mixed in with those follicles that are all through here is a kind of connective tissue which is described as a highly cellular connective tissue, meaning the fiber component is not as substantial as the cellular component. So they don't usually refer to these as fibroblasts, though that's essentially what they are, and they don't have a typical fibroblast shape. But most of the cells in here are part of that highly cellular connective tissue. And I won't take the time to color everything in here, but anyway, we'll identify this as highly cellular connective tissue. And then the red spots in here, these are follicles. Now the follicles after puberty begin, well, some of them will begin to enlarge to become mature follicles and rupture from the wall of the ovary and move down the oviduct. So what we need to do next is look at the development of individual follicles in the ovary. In these two pictures, we have a couple of the early follicle stages. The resting state of the follicle from before birth even until it begins to develop sometime during the reproductive years is what we call a primordial follicle here. In the primordial follicle, we have the large cell, the large nucleus, and the nucleolus shown in here. This whole thing is a primary oocyte. You recall with the male reproductive system, the primary spermatocyte was that cell that entered into the meiotic process, underwent the two meiotic divisions. So anyway, this cell here will undergo meiosis 1 and then meiosis 2. That cell is surrounded by more or less flattened cells that are follicle cells. So we have a whole ring around that. This looks very much like the drawings we made early on of the ganglion cell and satellite cells. But anyway, that makes up your primordial follicle, and they stay in that state for a very long period of time, many years. Some of the follicles with each reproductive cycle in the female begin to undergo the change to develop into mature follicles. And one of the first steps is the increase in the number of follicle cells. Instead of having low flattened cells and few of them, we increase the number of them quite a bit. And I've drawn one layer of them here, but they increase in numbers of layers. So we can add more cells to the outside of this, and we're still talking about the next stage, which is the primary follicle. Sounds a little bit too much like primordial, but anyway, this is the primary follicle. So we keep developing more follicle cells. We have follicle cell growth around the outside of this primary oocyte in the middle. At the same time as we're adding these more follicle cells, a zone develops around the oocyte, the primary oocyte. I'm going to indicate with green here. I've left a little room in there. A clear zone. It's like a clear fluid or gel that surrounds the entire oocyte here. And that's called the zona pellucida. Zona pellucida. That means a zone that's clear. A clear zone, the zona pellucida. So we have follicle cells. We still have that primary oocyte in there. We have the zona pellucida added in there, and I didn't label this as a primary follicle. This is the primary follicle. That kind of tells you that there's going to be a secondary follicle. And the change we'll see next is that in this ever-expanding region of follicle cells, we're going to form an empty space, a cavity within those cells, within that mass of cells, that's going to be called an antrum space. Also surrounding the follicle cells, we're going to see some developments in that highly cellular connective tissue that surrounds it. It's going to form what we call the theca layer, a theca interna and a theca externa. So that's in the secondary follicle. Let's draw that next. Okay, now here we are looking at what we call a secondary follicle. In the secondary follicle, one important thing is that this primary oocyte is no longer a primary oocyte. It's gone through its first meiotic division. When the egg cell, the oocyte, undergoes its division, it does not undergo an equal division of the cytoplasm. Most of the cytoplasm stays with only one of the two cells. The other cell that results is a very tiny little piece that's pushed off here to the side. I'll just make a little mark right there. Very small mass that just contains that extra chromosomal material that results from the first meiotic division. So now this is a haploid nucleus here, and there's that little haploid, what we call a polar body, off there on the side. So now we have right here, instead of a primary oocyte, it's now a secondary oocyte. Outside of that, we have the green zone that is still an area pellucida, or zona pellucida. Zona pellucida, the green line. These are all follicle cells out here. Hundreds and hundreds of them here. And this space I made mention of earlier that develops in those follicle cells, within that mass of follicle cells, is called an antrum. A-N-T-R-U-M. Antrum. The antrum. Outside of the follicle cells, we now have some organization of the highly cellular connective tissue that occurs out here with two zones. We have what's called the theca interna and then a theca externa. Theca is another name for like a shell or covering around something. So there's the internal layer and an external layer. The interna, theca interna cells will become hormone-producing cells as the need progresses. And the theca externa is more of a supportive, a structural network, more like a normal fibroblasts out there. But the theca interna cells become hormone-producing cells later on. So that's altogether, this is a secondary follicle. An important note right here, this secondary follicle, along with other follicles, may stop developing and simply disappear, undergo a regression and die. It's what we call atresia. It may become an atretic follicle that will just be digested within the ovary. Okay, we're now to our final stage of follicle development before ovulation, prior to ovulation. This final stage is we call the mature follicle. It's also known as a Graafian follicle, G-R-A-A-F-I-A-N follicle. Is another name, an alternative name for a mature follicle. At this stage, that antrum space that was within the follicle cell mass here has increased in size to become a huge structure. The primary volume of the whole thing now is made of this fluid-filled antrum within the follicle. The egg cell right there, the oocyte, is still a secondary oocyte. Surrounding that secondary oocyte, we still have that zona pellucida, indicated by the green. And then our follicle cells that surround the antrum out here and surround the oocyte, we divide into different named regions at this point. Those that immediately surround the oocyte right here make up what we call the corona radiata. Corona radiata, that just means a radiating crown of cells surrounding the oocyte there. They are supported and attached to the wall here by a region of cells. It's referred to as the cumulus oophorus. It's just an accumulation of follicle cells that form a base or attachment for the oocyte. The remaining follicle cells that surround the antrum here are referred to as granulosa cells. Granulosa cells. So, what we used to just identify as follicle cells, we now identify as follicle cells in these regions. The granulosa layer of cells, the corona radiata that forms that circle around the oocyte, and then the attachment clump of cells that are called the cumulus oophorus. We still have to the outside of the follicle the inner theca interna and the outer theca externa. There as well. So if this follicle matures without undergoing atresia, without being digested at some point, and generally just one follicle will make it to maturity, even though through the reproductive cycle, when we start the cycle, we may have several of the follicles begin to enlarge and become late primary or secondary follicles. Very few of them will ever make it to the mature follicle stage, generally only one per reproductive cycle in a human female. So anyway, this enlarges, it becomes more or less a blister-like spot on the surface of the ovary, and then eventually will rupture. And when it ruptures, the fluid from the antrum is expelled from the ovary, and the corona radiata cells, along with the oocyte, that is also expelled along with the fluid of the antrum. So all that stuff is pushed out of the ovary, really just into the body cavity. Once in the body cavity, that oocyte and its corona radiata is typically swept up into the oviduct by the cilia that line the oviduct and the fimbria. They kind of guide or lead the oocyte and the corona radiata cells up into the tube just by a flow of fluid generated by the cilia out there. Now we're back here looking at the ovary again. Remember that our follicle cells were located out here in the cortex. Those follicles enlarge, become secondary and mature follicles and such, and eventually form a blister-like spot that would be on the outside of the ovary. And once that expels, once that mature follicle that's out here breaks open, the egg cell, the oocyte, along with its surrounding follicle cells, is moved out of the ovary, out into that space. The tissues that remain on the ovary right here include those follicle cells that form the granulosa layer of the mature follicle. So those granulosa cells, the theca interna and the theca externa cells that were associated with that, all remain on the surface of the ovary as a little scar, a little spot on the surface of the ovary, and it may bleed a little bit and have a little bit of a blood spot in the middle originally, but eventually becomes a yellow scar on the outside of the ovary we call the corpus luteum. So essentially it becomes a bunch of the granulosa cells out here surrounded by little bits of theca interna and some theca externa out there. So anyway, we end up with this yellow spot called the corpus luteum. That corpus luteum is very important in our hormonal cycle. We'll talk about that later. It persists on the surface of the ovary for several days and eventually begins to regress. It's producing a fair amount of progesterone and some estrogens as it exists out there, but it becomes smaller and smaller, so it produces fewer and fewer hormones. And over time, that little spot eventually no longer has functioning hormonal producing cells. It simply becomes a fibrous type of scar, and then we call it a corpus albicans. Corpus means body, albicans refers to white. Luteum means yellow, so this is a yellow body, that's a white body. So when it's actively producing hormones until it regresses to the point to where you don't have active hormone-producing cells in abundance, it's called corpus luteum, then it becomes corpus albicans as a scar tissue on the outside of the ovary. So this usually happens within that normal 28 days.